Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I will give you just a
Hello.
moment to connect to audio. So everybody should be muted, but welcome. Come on in.
Hello.
Sorry, John, I'm going to mute you. I'm not sure why you're able to unmute. Our settings are supposed to be so configured as that only Simon and I are able to unmute ourselves. But
I'll say hi while I'm still unmuted.
Hi, Cindy. Well, clearly we've had some settings go wrong, but please stay muted, everyone. I'm glad to have you all. All right. Well, welcome to this first Friday lecture for the month of September 2025. We are doing this on the second Friday of September, as you all will have noticed, because we had an event last Friday. Our speaker today is basic program instructor Simon Friedland. Simon's lecture is entitled "A Christian Mystic Reads Homer, Simone Weil on the Iliad." This First Friday lecture is supported by the Anastoplo Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anastoplo. My name is Noah Shafitz, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that follows it, you will not be able, or you should not be able, you might be, but please don't, to unmute your microphones. But we invite you to enter questions for Simon into the chat box on Zoom at any time during today's event. Simon will have a chance to respond to your questions after his lecture. During the lecture, Simon and I will be able to see only a handful of your video feeds. You may choose to leave your video on or turn it off at your discretion. Simon's video will be spotlighted, so the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Before I give Simon a full introduction, let me tell you a little bit about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, coming up on just about 80 years, the basic program has offered students a rigorous education in the liberal arts through direct engagement with original texts in discussion-based courses led by highly dedicated instructors. At the heart of the basic program is our 4-year course sequence, which offers firsthand encounters with some of the greatest texts of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners. As I'm sure most of you know, a registration is ongoing for the fall quarter, and our sections have a tendency to fill up quickly. Many of them are already full, so I recommend that you reserve your spots as soon as you can. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on October 3rd. Our speaker will be Sheffield Family Distinguished Instructor in the Basic Program, Kendall Sharp, and the title of Kendall's lecture will be Free Men and Natural Slaves in Homer's Iliad and Aristotle's Politics. Today's speaker, Simon Friedland, joined the basic program instructional staff in 2023. He received his PhD in 2021 from the University of Chicago in German Studies. His dissertation is entitled The Pulse of Prosody, Versification and Antiquity in the Age of Weimar Classicism. From 2021 to 2023, Simon was a humanities teaching fellow at University of Chicago. Simon is a graduate of Reed College, and while he was a student, Simon spent 1 year in Berlin at the Freie Universität. All right, now let me hand things over to Simon. Simon, take it away, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Is that visible and am I audible? Okay, good. So I'd like to begin my talk today by addressing two of the terms in its title, namely Christian and mystic. Both terms inform my reading of Simone Weil's great essay on the Iliad, but neither term, when applied to such a heterodox thinker, is entirely straightforward. Weil was not, in a conventional institutional sense, a Christian. Born to secular Jewish parents in Paris in 1909, from an early age, Weil was, along with her brother Andre, who would go on to become one of his generation's great mathematicians, who ended his career at Princeton University, actually. The two of them were infused with classical French culture, with the works of Racine and Molière and the like, whose poetry never ceases to pepper Simone Weil's writings. She attended one of the most prestigious high schools in the French lycée system before pursuing her university studies at the famed École Normale Supérieure, where she was classmates with Jean-Paul Sartre, among others. At university, the Kantian rigorism of Weil's morals earned her the nickname the categorical imperative in skirts. Simone de Beauvoir recounts in her memoir how she once sought out the young Simone Weil, who had garnered a reputation for her bizarre outfits and for bursting into tears upon hearing of a famine in China. I managed to get near her one day, de Beauvoir writes. I don't know how the conversation got started. She declared in no uncertain tones that only one thing mattered in the world today, the revolution which would feed all the starving people of the earth. I retorted, no less peremptorily, that the problem was not to make men happy, but to find the reason for their existence. She looked me up and down. It's easy to see you've never gone hungry, she snapped. Our relationship did not go any further. Weil's political stance during this period, it's not hard to tell from this quote, was a kind of militant leftism. A satirical paper, seeing in her a kind of Marxist Joan of Arc, christened her the Red Virgin. And in 1936, galvanized by the Civil War in Spain, she insisted on joining the anarchists' fight against Franco's fascism, an endeavor that was only brought to an end when, with her characteristic physical maladroitness, she stepped in a tub of boiling cooking oil, resulting in severe burns that necessitated her return to France, much to her parents' relief. In a searing letter written to the French Catholic writer Georges Bernanos, who wrote a novel on the Spanish Civil War, Weil recounts her disillusionment with the struggle, her direct experience of how the dynamics of war can engulf and erase moral distinctions. While she was in Spain, she witnessed the anti-fascists carry out acts of barbarity equal to those of their enemy. Bernanos was so taken by this letter that he carried it in his wallet until his death. Weil's commitment to the most marginalized never wavered, but she became increasingly skeptical of institutions and collectivities of any kind, seeing in them an irresistible tendency towards the abuse of power. It may seem paradoxical, then, that she felt drawn to Catholicism. In 1940, she came into contact with the Catholic priest Joseph-Marie Perrin in Marseille, where she and her parents had taken up residence, fleeing the Nazi takeover of Paris. It was Father Perrin who first posed to her in practical terms the possibility of her baptism into the Catholic Church. Simone Weil was never baptized. The reasons for her remaining at this threshold of Christian existence make up much of the letters that she addressed to Father Perrin, and that were published posthumously in the collection Waiting for God. I can think of no better entry point into the demanding personality and thought of Simone Weil than these letters. In them, she says of herself that, quote, I always adopted the Christian attitude as the only possible one. I might say that I was born, I grew up, and I always remained within the Christian church, within the Christian inspiration, excuse me. Her justification for remaining unbaptized, despite, or perhaps even because of her adherence to what she calls the Christian inspiration, revolved around her sense of the Catholic Church as an exclusionary mechanism. Evoking the phrase by which the Church formally condemns and excommunicates, she wrote to Father Perrin, I should like to draw your attention to one point. It is that there is an absolutely insurmountable obstacle to the incarnation of Christianity. It is the use of the two little words anathema seat, let him or her be cast out or be cursed. It is not their existence, but the way they have been employed up till now. It is that also which prevents me from crossing the threshold of the church. I remain beside all those things which cannot enter the church, the universal repository, on account of those two little words. They saw the Catholic Church then as insufficiently Catholic, as it were, that is, universal. Her ranging intellect found fundamental spiritual truths embodied in Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism, in the polytheism of the Greeks, and she worried that adherence to the church would curtail her intellectual integrity. More importantly for her, though, she worried that belonging to the Catholic Church would cut her off from the suffering of all those who didn't belong. In an existential paradox typical of Wei's thought and of her life, she felt that the most Catholic stance was to stand outside the Catholic Church. Yet I don't think that Wei's position should be viewed as just a kind of willful posture of resistance. She writes that, quote, if one day it comes about that I love God enough to deserve the grace of baptism, I shall receive this grace on that very day, infallibly, in the form which God wills, either by means of baptism in the strict sense, or of the word, or in some other manner. Her lingering on the threshold of baptism, then, was less, I believe, a sort of political stance than it was an embodiment of her practice of waiting for God. The French verb for to wait, attendre, is related to the noun attention, attention. And it is this attending to God, not in the sense of a strained mental concentration, but in the sense of a letting go, a relinquishing of the will, an emptying out of the self such that what is wholly other, what is not I, could enter in. That, I believe, determined Wei's spiritually liminal status. Wei's notion of attention as a self-effacing openness to the other already touches on the mystical dimension of her thought. Mysticism is a slippery concept, one that I don't purport to have a handle on. Wei has often been called a mystic, and she is included in a recent book, Modern Mystics, by one of the foremost scholars of Western Christian mysticism, Bernard McGinn, who is a University of Chicago professor emeritus. But I would like to give here my own account, or really my own impression of what might be termed mysticism, in the hope that it's not entirely arbitrary and may be illuminating for an understanding of Simone Weil. It's an impression that came to me from teaching the Persian Sufi poet Rumi to first-year students in the poetry sequence in the University of Chicago's Humanities Corps. For many, I think the word mysticism can evoke a kind of murky spirituality, an effusive embrace of irrationality, a kind of vague gesturing towards the ineffable. I'd suggest that nothing could be further from the case. Mysticism, it seems to me, is one of the most logically rigorous and existentially committed ways of standing in a relation to God. For if God is not just some additional thing out there in the world, if God is by definition eternal, infinite, absolute, then it follows that there exists a qualitative disjunction between we who are finite, bound in space and time, conditioned, irreducibly dependent, and God. How do we as finite creatures, as created beings, encounter that which is infinite and uncreated? Indeed, even posing the question in this way presents pitfalls. For to say that which is infinite and uncreated is to grammatically construe God as just another grammatical subject to which various predicates apply. So is there any way to overcome this impasse, to bridge this gap between the human being and God? Mysticism, to my mind, constitutes a response to this question, a response that is motivated not by the ambition to solve on paper a philosophical conundrum, but by a yearning to be in the presence of, to dwell in and be indwelt by the divine. The mystical response to this yearning takes, my impression is, many forms, of which I will only mention one here, namely the cultivation of selflessness. For it is, in a sense, ourselves, our egos, that are constrained and constraining, that are self-absorbed and self-obsessed. How can God be in us? How can we be in God when we are full of ourselves? This egoism, to be clear, is not, I think, just some kind of moral flaw or failure, although this line of thought has the potential of lapsing into a kind of self-hatred. But taken rigorously, the problem is not moral but structural, and the solution is not self-hatred but spiritual practice. Simone Weil had an acute sense of how it is in the very structure of the individually instantiated human consciousness to experience itself as at the center of the world. My only access to the world is through me. I experience reality as radiating from me and filtered back through me. Weil writes in what I find to be one of her most beautiful essays entitled Forms of the Implicit Love of God, each man imagines that he is situated in the center of the world. The illusion of perspective places him at the center of space. An illusion of the same kind falsifies his idea of time. And yet another kindred illusion arranges a whole hierarchy of values around him. This illusion is extended even to our sense of existence on account of the intimate connection between our senses of value and our sense of being. Being seems to us less concentrated the further it is removed from us. To remove the veil of the ego, then, would be to experience reality, reality which is for the mystic ultimately synonymous with God. This is, I believe, where the ascetic practices come in that one might associate with mysticism, the fasting, the flagellation, the vigils, which from the outside can look like sheer perversity, and which can no doubt take on pathological proportions when not purified by egoistic concerns, but which, when practiced rigorously and responsibly, serve not to prick the ego with the morbid pleasures of self-abasement, but to open oneself. Indeed, to become open in such a way that that persistent, imperious, pesky, reflexive pronoun, oneself, that keeps referring acts back to me, may be suspended, and an encounter with what is qualitatively other than ourselves, God, becomes possible. For Weil, as I believe for the other great masters of the mystical tradition, this selflessness had an irreducibly ethical dimension, one that is inseparable from the encounter with God. For to pierce through the carapace of the self, so to speak, to achieve a state of impersonality, enables an encounter with other human beings that is not finally self-reflexive, that doesn't inevitably refer their wants back and needs back to me. Weil has a word for this mystical selflessness that I've been struggling to describe here, namely decreation, which she distinguishes from destruction. Destruction in this spiritual context is a willful act of self-violence that ends up asserting and exacerbating the self in an effort to deny it. Decreation, by contrast, is an unforced act of acquiescence that, in Weil's theology, mirrors God, whom she understood in creating the world, to have voluntarily renounced being absolutely and immediately everything, so that other things, including us, might be. To be godlike, then, would not be to glorify the ego as absolute, but rather to imitate this divine act of letting others be. In a paradox typical for Weil's thought, creativity is accomplished through decreation, not by imposing one's powers on the world, but in allowing oneself to be a transparent medium that lets the light in. They believed that the greatest works of art were unclouded by the ego of the author and thereby flooded with a light that clarifies the contours of reality. She found this luminosity above all in the Iliad. I hope I've gone some way then in clarifying what it might mean to call Simone Weil a Christian mystic. and in doing so have given an initial impression of the shape of her life and thought. It remains to be shown how this life and thought informs her reading of the Iliad. The essay entitled The Iliad or the Poem of Force was composed under dire circumstances in the autumn of 1939 on the cusp of World War II. And it is impossible not to hear the whole horror of that moment in the essay's first lines, lines that are as prescient as they are descriptive, here translated by Mary McCarthy. The true subject, I quote, the true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. Force employed by man, force that enslaves man, force before which man's flesh shrinks away. In this work, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relations with force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle, as deformed by the weight of the force it submits to. For those dreamers who consider that force, thanks to progress, would soon be a thing of the past, the Iliad could appear as an historical document. For others, whose powers of recognition are more acute and who perceive force today as yesterday, at the very center of human history, the Iliad is the purest and loveliest of mirrors. What then is the Iliad really about? Weil is asking here. What is finally at stake in this poem? What is its true subject? Her answer is that the Iliad is not ultimately about the wrath of Achilles or about the Trojan War or about the collective self-understanding of the Greek people, their conception of divinity, their values, and so on, but rather about force. Or rather, all those things that we might conventionally take the Iliad to be about are but the outward manifestations of this underlying phenomenon, a phenomenon that they daringly and disconcertingly claims is at the very center of human history. What then is force? Something of an answer is given in the next paragraph. To define force, it is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Exercised to its limit, it turns man into a thing in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse out of him. Somebody was here, and the next minute there's nobody here at all. This is a spectacle the Iliad never wearies of showing us. Yet taken alone, this claim can give the impression that force is simply synonymous with lethal violence. Death is certainly one of the outcomes of force. But in Weil's thinking, it is not the only way in which a human being can become a thing. More horrifying than death, and more difficult to explain, is the force that, quote, has the ability to turn a human being into a thing while he is still alive. He is alive, he has a soul, and yet he is a thing. An extraordinary entity, this, a thing that has a soul. And as for the soul, what an extraordinary house it finds itself in. Who can say what it costs it, moment by moment, to accommodate itself to this residence? How much writhing and bending, folding and pleating are required of it? It was not made to live inside a thing. If it does so, under pressure of necessity, there is not a single element of its nature to which violence is not done. To illustrate this phenomenon, Weil turns to those wrenching scenes of supplication that populate the Iliad. Scenes where one warrior, disarmed and defeated in one-on-one combat, begs his vanquisher for his life. This state of absolute abject submission is petrifying. The human being takes on the qualities of inanimate matter. Weil meditates in this context on the strange power that other human beings exert on us. Alone in our rooms, she writes, we get up, walk about, sit down again quite differently from the way we do when we have a visitor. It is this human presence that the suppliant lacks. He can be cast aside or cut down as inert matter. It is clear then from this example that force is not synonymous with lethal violence alone, for the mortal blow has not yet been dealt. Weil's other example of the effects of force is slavery, which in her view is essentially the state of the supplicant made permanent. In focusing on slavery and supplication as effects of force in the Iliad, Weil was probing a phenomenon to which she devoted great attention throughout the last decade of her short life, namely what she calls le malheur, often translated as affliction. She considered herself to have personally experienced such affliction. In 1934, she took a leave of absence from her teaching position to work in a series of factories in the Paris environs. Like many leftist intellectuals from bourgeois backgrounds, the parallel case of George Orwell comes to mind here. She was motivated by a desire to know firsthand the conditions of the working class, whose struggle was her political raison d'etre. Her frequent migraines and fragile physical condition made her wholly unsuitable for such labor. After a year, she was, by her own account, left in tatters. In the wake of this experience, there appears in her writing a newfound focus on what it is like to suffer. Her most sustained meditation on this theme is an essay written in 1942 entitled Affliction and the Love of God. Here, she makes a distinction between la souffrance, suffering, and le malheur, affliction. Suffering is pain, but pain that leaves the individual essentially intact. Affliction, by contrast, involves physical pain, but entails the complete undoing of the individual. She writes, there is no real affliction unless the event which has seized and uprooted a life attacks it, directly or indirectly, in all its parts, social, psychological, and physical. The social factor is essential. There is not really affliction where there is not social degradation or the fear of it in some form or another. Weil's essay might be called a phenomenology of affliction, in that she attempts to do justice to its experiential dimension, how the world appears, or more accurately, disappears when one is afflicted, how the afflicted person appears in the world, or more accurately, disappears from the world. For she insists that it is in the nature of affliction to render one invisible, or visible only in the manner of an object, as in slavery or supplication. This is because the social dimension of affliction entails being cast into the position of the scapegoat. That is, being misrecognized as the source of social ill that rightly needs to be eradicated, rather than being the innocent victim of society's dysfunctions. Because affliction works from the inside as well, seizing one psychologically, they thought that the afflicted tend to feel themselves to be somehow guilty, which makes the state all the more difficult to alleviate. In describing the phenomenon of affliction, they no doubt had in mind all the dispossessed, all the deracinated whose plight had moved her from an early age. From the soldiers in the trenches of World War I, she's said to have foregone sugar as a girl in solidarity with the soldiers on the front. To the factory workers next to whom she clumsily labored. To the masses of refugees who accompanied her flight in exile in the early 1940s. Yet she came to feel that the phenomenon of radical, or rather deracinated suffering that she called le malheur, went too deep, was too transformative of a person to be fully accounted for in terms exclusively of political oppression, any more than Job's suffering, and she cherished the book of Job, could be explained in purely immanent, this worldly terms. In short, they came to feel that affliction was fundamentally a spiritual problem, a problem that attacks the soul, and that therefore demanded a spiritual response. Indeed, I tend to think of Weil as a physicist of the soul, a physicist of the soul. Her intellect is attuned to the pressures and impulses to which the human being is subject, not just as a body in space, but as a soul seeking God. In this regard, it is striking that she takes as the master concept of her Iliad analysis a term central to Newtonian physics. Like gravity, which not coincidentally is another key word in her spiritual vocabulary, force is not visible directly, but only by its effects. It seems to me that the accomplishment of Weil's essay on the Iliad lies in its careful observation of the terrestrial bodies that are the focus of this poem, namely human beings, formulating on the basis of those observations a hypothesis about the underlying mechanism that governs their motions. And like gravity, this underlying mechanism of force is not in the possession of certain privileged individuals, but rather something to which all ultimately are subjected. Weil writes, force is as pitiless to the man who possesses it, or thinks he does, as it is to his victims. The second it crushes, the first it intoxicates. The truth is, nobody really possesses it. The human race is not divided up in the Iliad into conquered persons, slaves, suppliants on the one hand, and conquerors and chiefs on the other. In this poem, there is not a single man who does not at one time or another have to bow his neck to force. Weil exhibits a marvelous sensitivity for the tidal movements of war in the Iliad, so to speak, the ebb and flow of battle as each side intermittently enjoys what seems like a decisive martial superiority, but which inevitably suffers reversal. This reversal really is, in Weil's reading, inevitable as the motion of the tides. Whichever hero enjoys the high tide of force believes himself innately and exceptionally endowed with a superior strength. But this is precisely the illusion that force creates. Force, when one is imbued with it, cannot help but being abused. Yet its abuse calls forth an overstepping of one's own limits that inexorably leads one to becoming the victim of force in turn. There is, in Weil's view, what she calls a geometric rigor to the logic of this reversal in the Iliad. In describing the effects of force, how it sets human beings into motion, how it transforms them, I believe that Weil is describing nothing more or less than the dynamics of reciprocal violence. Force, then, is not some mysterious extraterrestrial power that bizarrely governs the world of the Iliad. Force is purely human, a result of human reactivity, and yet so inevitable in its effects that it is experienced as superhuman or inhuman. Weil, as a physicist of the soul, had an acute sense for the way in which even, and perhaps especially in human affairs, there is for every action an equal and opposite reaction. In one of the notes published after her death in the collection entitled Gravity and Grace, she writes of her intense desire at moments when the migraines that plagued her throughout her life reached a crisis point to hit someone at exactly the place on their forehead where she was feeling the pain. I think it would be a mistake to view this desire as just a personal pathology or a moral failure on Weil's part. Rather, it serves as an idiosyncratic illustration of what she calls human mechanics. In another note from Gravity and Grace, she writes, human mechanics. Whoever suffers tries to communicate his suffering, either by ill-treating someone or calling forth their pity, in order to reduce it. And he does really reduce it in this way. In the case of a man in the uttermost depths, whom no one pities, who is without power to ill-treat anyone, if he has no child or being who he loves, the suffering remains within and poisons him. This imperative, like gravity, how can one gain deliverance? How gain deliverance from a force which is like gravity? Weil is articulating something of her philosophy of human behavior here. It stems from her particular perspective on our finitude, or what she calls le vide, the void within us. We are beings who lack, beings who hunger. Indeed, there would be no human striving, there would be no desire were we to experience ourselves as complete, as replete. Yet Weil thinks that our constitutive incompleteness gives rise to all sorts of compensatory activities, efforts to fill the void. Indeed, she believes that evil is essentially an effort to deny our finitude, to efface the emptiness that is so acutely painful to us by transferring it to another. For Weil, the Iliad is about what happens when this impulse to retaliate, this need to transfer one's own suffering to another, and in doing so, create the illusion of reestablishing an equilibrium that has been disturbed by one's own suffering, is directed outward. Indeed, I think this is just what war is for Weil, this human, all too human dynamic at the center, uh, at the center of human history. Yet the recognition of this dynamic and the recognition that what motivates it is illusory, namely compensatory revenge, the idea that I can fill the void within me by creating it in another, doesn't make the dynamic any more resistible. Just because we can describe the workings of gravity with increasing precision and predicative accuracy doesn't make us any less subject to it. This is, needless to say, an exceptionally dark vision of the Iliad. The value that Weil finds in this vision, though, lies in what she calls the extraordinary sense of equity which breathes through the Iliad. Simply put, in her view, the poem doesn't take sides. Its perspective remains unclouded by the miasmas of force. It sees through the illusion that force creates, the illusion that one side is superior to the other, be it physically, be it morally. Trojan and Greek are treated with equal care, for they stand they stand equally under the empire of force. It is this sense of equity that nourishes what might be called the poem's tone, which is in Weil's strange but I think sensitive reading, one of bitterness that arises out of tenderness. She writes, such a heaping up of violent deeds would have a frigid effect, were it not for the note of incurable bitterness that continually makes itself heard. Though often only a single word marks its presence, often a mere stroke of the verse or a run-on line. It is in this that the Iliad is absolutely unique, in this bitterness that proceeds from tenderness and that spreads over the whole human race, impartial as sunlight. Never does the tone lose its coloring of bitterness, yet never does the bitterness drop into lamentation. Justice and love, which have hardly any place in the study of extremes and of unjust acts of violence, nevertheless bathe the work in their light, without ever becoming noticeable themselves, except as a kind of accent. Nothing precious is scorned, whether or not death is its destiny. Everyone's unhappiness is laid bare without dissimulation or disdain. No man is set above or below the condition common to all men. Whatever is destroyed is regretted. Victors and vanquished are brought equally near us, under the same head. Both are seen as counterparts of the poet, and the listener as well. If there is any difference, it is that the enemy's misfortunes are possibly more sharply felt. The Iliad, then, is at once shorn of sentimentality and free from the frigidity of unfeeling cynicism. Its bitterness emerges not from hopelessness, but from tenderness, a tenderness that is itself born of an ultimate affirmation of life, for only a deep sense of life's value could make its loss bitter. As her first example of the way in which a single word or phrase can evoke bitterness, Weil cites two lines referring to the death of the Trojan Iphidamas in Book 11. So he fell there, put to sleep in the sleep of bronze, unhappy man, far from his wife defending his own people. Weil, who had a command of ancient Greek, translated herself all the passages that she cites from the Iliad. Unhappy man is Mary McCarthy's translation of Weil's substantivized adjective le malheureux, perhaps better rendered in Weil's spiritual vocabulary as the afflicted one. Le malheureux, in turn, is her translation of the Greek oiktros, commonly translated as pitiable or lamentable. Such predicates would doubtlessly have been too lachrymose for Weil. It is striking to see how she endows the Trojan warrior with the mark of affliction in the very translation of his death. And it raises questions about the extent to which she is reading her spiritual vision into rather than out of the Iliad. How might this spiritual vision be encapsulated? How exactly does Weil's style of Christian mysticism, as I outlined it at the beginning of my talk, ultimately bear upon her reading of the Iliad? I would like to consider a response to this question by way of a conclusion to my talk. At the end of her essay, we find the claim that, quote, the Gospels are the last marvelous expression of the Greek genius, as the Iliad is the first. Now, I am not in the business of making such claims. I'm skeptical about the extent to which one can speak of the Greek genius in any monolithic way. And her delimitation of this Greek genius as definitively concluding with the Gospels, which she thereby sets in a direct relation with the Iliad as beginning relates to end, strikes me as chauvinist, to say the least. I don't intend to advocate for this reading here, but to try to understand it. T.S. Eliot wrote of in trying to understand her, we must not be distracted, as is all too likely to happen on a first reading, by considering how far and at what points we agree or disagree. We must simply expose ourselves to the personality of a woman of genius, of a kind of genius akin to that of the saints. I cannot conceive of anybody as agreeing with all of her views or of not disagreeing violently with some of them. But agreement and rejection are secondary. What matters is to make contact with a great soul. Perhaps this view of how to encounter Weil is too hagiographic, too uncritical. But in order to criticize, one must first understand. I think we already have the key to comprehending the connection to the Gospels in Weil's account of affliction as it manifests itself in the Iliad. For she sees in the Gospel accounts of the Passion the same rendering of affliction. She writes that, oh, I'm sorry, I think I forgot to include this quote, so I'll just read it out loud and you'll just have to listen. She writes that, quote, the accounts of the Passion show that a divine spirit, incarnate, is changed by misfortune, trembles before suffering and death, feels itself, in the depths of its agony, to be cut off from man and God. The sense of human misery gives the Gospels that accent of simplicity that is the mark of the Greek genius, and that endows Greek tragedy and the Iliad with all their value, end quote. The crucifixion was a kind of fixation for Weil. In it, she saw the truth of affliction. For Weil, the most meaningful words in the Gospels were Christ's on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which she read as an expression of the ultimate alienation of affliction, an alienation so great that God could feel infinitely separated from God. It is not then that for Weil the Gospels redeem the nightmare vision of the Iliad by promising an afterlife and a judgment of the wicked. She felt that such promises could become escape hatches through which one could take flight from the reality of the present moment into fantasies of future delights. She places the Iliad and the Gospels on nearly equal footing in the simple, unsentimental recognition of the working of force in human history. But as I said before, the recognition of force doesn't free us from it any more than an understanding of gravity makes us weightless. Where then does this leave us? Are we fully determined and therefore doomed by the reactivity of matter? How, to recall Weil's words, can one gain deliverance? How gain deliverance from a force which is like gravity? Weil writes of what she calls moments de grâce, moments of grace in the Iliad, moments that are realized in love. Thetis' love for Achilles, Achilles' love for Patroclus, Andromache's love for Hector. But what is love such that it can escape the empire of force? An aphorism in Gravity and Grace states, belief in the existence of other human beings as such is love. The thought, expressed with typical Weian extremity, seems to be that it is only in love that we fully acknowledge, that we are fully attentive to the existential reality of another human being. They're irreducibly existing here, now, before me, in no essential way different from me. The great challenge of human life is to believe in the existence of other human beings as such, that is to say, to love. Indeed, for Weil, this challenge exceeds our natural capacities. The default mode of human relationality is force. It need not express itself in so explicit and physically domineering a form as slavery or supplication. Another aphorism from Gravity and Grace states that the soul is like a gas. It will fill as much space as is available to us, as is available to it. For Weil, we can't naturally limit ourselves any more than a gas can naturally limit itself. Thus, the paradox of being human is that what we need to live together nonviolently, which is to say, what we need to survive as a species, is beyond our grasp. For love is not a force. It cannot be forced. It can only be attended to. That is to say, waited for, not willed into existence. Yet this does not entail an irresponsible posture of passivity, a sitting around in expectation of divine intervention while the world burns. Rather, it calls for something like so to speak, the cultivation of the field of the soul. Weil writes in regard to the efforts of the will, the weeds are pulled up by the muscular effort of the peasant, but only sun and water can make the corn grow. The will cannot produce any good in the soul. For Weil, the good comes from above. It cannot be commanded, but the fertile soil to receive it can be cultivated. And this need not entail the extremes of asceticism. In her philosophy, the experience of beauty, for instance, constitutes a training in love. Indeed, it is a form of love. For to find something beautiful is to cherish its existence just how it is. If I find a poem beautiful, I do not wish that a line be added or subtracted, that it be other than it is. In the experience of beauty, I relinquish the will to acquire and thereby alter the object of my desire. If in viewing a painting, I calculate about how I might purchase it, I am not relating to it in the mode of beauty. A painting can be owned, but beauty cannot be possessed. Indeed, beauty only appears at a distance, when my acquisitive relation to the world has been suspended, when I hold in abeyance my desire to consume the object with my egoistic plans and projects. This act of letting be that beauty inspires in us is, for Weil, the heart of love. And I would suggest that it is this suspension of presuppositions, this attitude of non-reactive awareness, this contemplative distance that is itself a higher form of intimacy because it lovingly allows what we are encountering to be what it is, not what we wish it to be. In short, the habit of being that Weil calls attention that we cultivate in the basic program. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you for that very stimulating, lovely talk. We have a number of questions from our audience. I have tried to organize these thematically. If I don't make it to someone's questions, my apologies in advance. If there are further questions that people in the audience have, you can still enter them into the chat and I will relay them to Simon. So the first question I have is actually going to be a combination of two questions, one from June Melchior and one from Lori Yu. June asks, in her essay, does Vey point to specific people or elements of the story of the Iliad, or does she write of the poem as a whole? Lori asks, in your reading, does Vey cherish any particular character in the Iliad over other characters? If so, who and why? I'll note that we heard at some length about Ephidimus, hardly a major character, and we heard a bit about the love between certain characters and the outstanding abilities of characters. But I wonder if there are more prominent examples in the essay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. And I realized in my talk I didn't get into so much of the details of her kind of individual accounts of passages. I was a bit more concerned to kind of unfold her reading within the larger context of her thought. But she certainly does, discuss numerous passages in detail. I mean, it's interesting. Her mode of reading is less. She quotes the Iliad as in specific passages in the Iliad more to offers examples that instantiate her claims than um, you know, then she does really sort of unpack or do close readings of individual passages. But there certainly it's a text that is full of citations. Um, yeah, I briefly mentioned several, the more prominent characters as well as one of the more obscure characters. It's a really interesting question if she sort of favors, uh, you know, um, a particular character, and in the way that I think we all sort of tend to do when we read, Hector or Achilles or these individual characters speak to us. I have the impression that she doesn't. And that seems to me in keeping with her claim about this, what she calls extraordinary equity of the text. That it's not, just about Achilles or about Hector. That, in fact, although certain characters may have more, more lines devoted to them, all characters are bathed in this equal light of care, of caring that comes from the sort of sense of the tragedy of them, of us. And that's her sort of audacious connection there, between them and us, are under the empire of force. So that's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Thanks, Hyman. The next two questions are also thematically related, so I'm going to group them, but I'm going to ask them one at a time. So the first comes from Jeffrey, I believe it's Tizer. My apologies, Jeffrey, if I'm getting your last name pronunciation wrong. The question is, with force being so fierce and all-consuming, what space is left for choice and moral responsibility? Put another way, are humans essentially powerless in the face of force?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a great question. I mean, it's a key question. Um, there is something in Vey's philosophy that seems uh highly deterministic. um as a physicist of the soul, so to speak. I mean, she thinks that we are sort of fully bound by matter. um uh you know the 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 best answer I can give is that there is a kind of mode of being that one can cultivate. And indeed, I mean, I think that implies some uh, some form of agency or some form of will. Otherwise, it couldn't, we couldn't cultivate it. Um, that could not so much resist in an active way, but could um, absorb the impacts of force in such a way that we aren't just sort of reactively, deterministically bouncing back from them onto others. Uh, and I tried to outline a bit with our cultivation of beauty or our appreciation of beauty, where we kind of rest in an attentive, non-reactive awareness to the object. How a certain mode like that could be possible. Um,
Great. It could be that you've just addressed the second question that I'm grouping together with this first one. That the second question lays the emphasis not on moral responsibility and choice, but on it's broader, the response to force generally. So I'll pose it anyway and see if you have anything more to say about this more general related question. So this is from Jerome Bowman. Question is, does Weil recognize the possibility of a response to force, presumably of any kind, that can overcome force's ability to transform the object of the force into an object? I guess the grammatical object of the force, or the thing receiving the force into an object.
mm, um, I mean, if I'm understanding this correctly, I think Weil thinks that the problem is that that our response to force, our response to the power that others exert over us, uh, is to react in kind. um, that when we suffer injury, it's almost impossible. I mean, that energy needs to go somewhere. Like there needs to be an outlet. We need to release somehow. Um, and the problem is that when we release on others, or when we release on ourselves, for that matter, when we turn that inward in a kind of self-hatred or self-castigating gesture, we turn others and ourselves into objects. So we treat them as objects, sometimes in very almost literal senses, like in real sort of physical or lethal acts of violence, but other times just in sort of projecting our wills onto them, uh, and so I think she thinks that the only way to not do that is to somehow absorb the impact. But that's, in Weil's view, that is unnatural. Like it's as unnatural as my pressing my hand on the table and the table not pressing back at me. That's just the sort of definition of of Newtonian physics. Um, but she thinks that there's another realm of of being, and that it is in a cultivation of a kind of access to that realm, um, that we can achieve that non-reactivity, which of course, I mean, she sees as the non-reactivity of Christ on the cross, that he doesn't fight back, he doesn't you know unleash himself upon the, upon others, but absorbs that, and that's her sort of ultimate ethical model there.
Thank you, Simon. The next question we have comes from Bert Lyons. Bert asks, would Weil say that our propensity to allow ideologies to turn us into ideologues is an inability to manage force?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I like that formulation, and I also like that thinking of force not just as something like physical, like hitting someone over the head, but as ideological or ideational. Um, and I mentioned how skeptical Weil is of institutions and the way in which um, institutions, in her view, can themselves become objects of worship, and sort of ideological spaces that we take flight into and feel good about occupying, um, because they seem to inure us to the vulnerabilities and the ultimate exposure of human existence. So I think there's certainly a sort of ideological or ideational dimension to force. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm going to ask a follow-up question about that. So is the sense that institutions serve as harbors for us from force? Are they also um, agents in some sense of force? Do they visit force on us? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that has to be the case. I mean, um, you know, yeah, I mean, they're they're means for the assertion of power. And I mean, Vey was very critical about the Catholic Church historically in the very, sort of concrete ways of, the Inquisition, the colonization of the Americas, and so on and so forth. That kind of instantiation of force that is very physical and violent. Um, but but yes, I mean, I think the more sort of subtle dimension of kind of ideological manipulation is certainly there as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for the question, Bert. So while you were answering a previous question, Stephen Kvall asked, is the non-reactivity to force that you were describing, is that a function of grace?
Yeah, I mean, I think she would call that something like grace. Yes. I mean, grace is a difficult concept to work with, and in my I'm teaching a class. I'm doing a class on Vey right now, and we're reading Gravity and Grace next week. So I hope to have a kind of better account of this uh, by next week. But um, yes, I mean, I think that reactivity, although we can cultivate modes of making that possible, is ultimately a kind of superhuman gift in her view, in that sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. All right, that next question, are there two of them that are questions about influence and a relationship between Bayes' thinking and others. The first is from Martin Lay. Martin begins with some praise. What a fascinating exploration of the problem of force in the context of structures between self and other. Your excellent introduction led me to ponder, and here we're into the question, how Weil fits into the tradition of philosophy, including Nietzsche and others, that led to structuralism and post-structuralism, including deconstruction, which explore the agency or force of language on our identities, and a kind of and that explore a kind of divided self or inherent alienation.
Uh-huh.
And how many of those thinkers led Martin to ponder how many of these thinkers brought in Marx to factor in the problem of social alienation, which led them to socio-political positions very similar to Weil. So here's the question portion. How does Weil fit in this tradition that Martin is describing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good and very big and sort of complex question of intellectual history. Um, They really disliked Nietzsche, uh, but I think that there are certain connections there with Nietzsche. I mean, for those of you who've taken the basic program and recall the genealogy of morals, the way in which Nietzsche describes the problem of our suffering and our need for a meaning for suffering, in the way in which we need some outlet for our suffering, and how that how that leads to a kind of scapegoating mechanism that those whom he calls the ascetic priests kind of turn against us and make us feel guilty. Um, I think that's similar to the dynamics that Vey is herself remarking on, although she goes in a different direction um, with it. I think the question of structuralism and post-structuralism, I think that there were so I generally see her in a more existentialist tradition, coming from, say, Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, um, and in certain ways closer to a writer like Camus, although Camus, of course, was an atheist. But Camus once said, when he won the Nobel Prize, I think this was in the 1950s, I might be mistaken, and an interviewer asked him, "Who do you think is the most important contemporary influence on your thought?" And Camus said, "Simone Weil." And the interviewer said, "But she's dead." But Camus said, "Yeah, that hasn't affected our relationship any." And I always loved that, and I think it's a sort of, that's how I feel about the text and the basic program. Like, the authors being dead don't seem to impact my relationship with them at all. But as far as, the structuralists and post-structuralists, I don't directly see them as taking up they. Um, but I can see how, her attention to power could, could be a kind of affinity um, there. Yeah, but it's not a sort of direct lineage as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks for the question. Martin, this next question is also about lineage, or at least relationships between different sets of theories. So Mary Harrison asks, do you see a relationship between Weil's emphasis upon belief in the existence of the other as love and the I-thou relation in Martin Buber, and or the face of the other in Emmanuel Levinas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know those texts well enough. I did read I and Thou at a certain point in time. I think that there must be connections there. Levinas read Weil and has an essay on Weil, although it it's critical of her in many ways. But I think those kinds of figurations of otherness in modern philosophy and modern thought, those kinds of figurations of an encounter with, what is not objectifiable, um, seem very close to her. Yes.
Thanks, Simon. The next question, again, two related questions. The first is from Evan Ho. Which translation of the Iliad did Weil read? Would it have made much of a difference in her theory formation if she had read another translation?
That's a great question. I don't know. My level of a scholarship is not, is not quite there. But the ultimate answer was she read it in Greek. I don't know which Greek edition she used, if that would make a radical difference. But um, yeah, I mean, it's not as though she was reading it in the Lattimore translation rather than the Fagles translation, and that would have sort of really colored her view of Helen or something like that. I mean, she did have that access to the original um, language, but and my Greek is not good enough. I don't have an access to really have analyzed her translations of it beyond the one that I mentioned in my talk, but that would be a really interesting project. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. There's one more question about translations from Patricia Brichta. So she says, thank you for the stunning Twombly illustrations. Building on Evan Ho's question, do you think there's an English language translation that better captures Weil's ideas about force?
So of the Iliad of essay, I love Mary McCarthy's translation. I think it's also just a really great sort of moment in 20th century, cultural history, that you have Mary McCarthy, that you have this great American woman of letters translating Weil. And there's a more recent edition that is a kind of critical edition of the Iliad essay that is by James Holka, Holoka, that is probably more accurate, more than McCarthy's translation, but less poetic in that regard, but it has a more rigorous scholarly kind of apparatus to it that's and notes and so forth that are to be recommended if you're interested in pursuing that. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. Um, the next question is about something you touched on at the beginning of the lecture, but I wonder if you might want to say more about it. So Ray Lucchese asks, would you see Wei's view of force in the light of the rise of Nazi Germany in Europe of her age?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, she must have been she must have been thinking about that. And you know, she was feeling the effects of that. That of course personally impacted her. And I think that's part of the power of the essay that it is in many ways. It seems to me very accurate, very precise working out of the underlying dynamics or the underlying mechanisms of of um, of Nazism, um, among other things. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. A question just came in again about influence or the relationship between Wei's thought and those of others. So Gordon Hart asks whether you can expand on the relationship between Wei's thought and Kierkegaard, and particularly his concepts of the nights of infinite resignation and infinite faith.
Oh gosh, I would have to enlist my wife for on this one. She's the Kierkegaard scholar, not me. You know, not so much off the top of my head. I mean, they, I mean, I would say in general, um, you know, they was very drawn to Catholicism for various reasons, but there's also something very Protestant in spirit about her and Kierkegaardian in that that skepticism of institutions, in her reading of the Gospels not as a sort of uh, embodying like a systematic dogma um, or doctrine, but rather as a laying bare of like the existential truths of the human condition. And I mean, I think the way she lived that in her sort of outsider status, and in the way in which, you know, she refused to sort of monastically cordon herself off from society, but kind of enter into the depths of it. You know, it is from my recollections, you know, something close to the kind of Kierkegaardian, you know, the Kierkegaardian figure, the Knight of Faith. Yeah.
This is a good question. You can copy and paste it into a document and put it to your wife in a
She's
moment.
here.
Yeah. Oh,
She's
all
in
right.
attendance, but I won't put her on the spot.
Great. We better not. So there's one more question, and it comes from our own Cindy Rutz. Cindy says Wei's definition of force is turning someone into a thing. Connection to Kant's categorical imperative? Question mark. I suppose you could say. Is there a connection here to Kant's categorical imperative?
Yeah, I think that that's a good thought. I mean, I think, you know, the idea of a kingdom of ends, so to speak, and the idea of the problem of our treating others as means, which is in Wei's sort of existentialist terminology, to not fully recognize that the other exists, um, is one could give that a more Kantian formulation, and she was a serious reader of Kant. Um, Now, of course, I think she has another kind of ultimate response to that that's not within the, you know, within the realm of reason alone. I think that's where she certainly breaks out from Kant. Uh, you know, that the ultimate answer to that is not grounded in a sort of definition of ourselves as self-legislating beings, but rather is like a breaking out of ourselves as as beings who in some way can't self-legislate. That I think that's where her divergence would lie.
And
Yeah.
there's a really interesting symmetry there. All right. Well, we've come to the end of the lecture. We have a tradition in the basic program that we're going to keep going in 2025 to 2026. The tradition is at the end here, we will do our best to act as if we're in an auditorium together. I'm going to ask all of you to unmute, and we can thank Simon with our hands clapping and with our voices. So here we go. I'm going to ask you all to unmute.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks.
It was so great.
Thank you.
Thank you, lecture.
Thank
you very
much.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks.
I just love this.
Great talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to stop our recording.